everybody. It's 8 o'clock. It's Thursday evening, and you're here on the Smart Connector group, or perhaps you're watching as a watch party on one of my pages. But anyway, welcome. I have an absolutely fantastic guest for you tonight, Max Branstetter. Welcome, Max.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. So Max is host of the Wild Business Growth podcast, which is a really exciting podcast. If you haven't listened in already, I would definitely recommend you visit and listen, because he's got some awesome guests. And he's also has an agency, don't you, Max? A marketing agency called Hippo Direct. And the most exciting thing, is that he is live all the way from New York. Isn't that exciting, everybody?
It sounds like I thought that sounded like an intro to Saturday Night Live. I think we might get sued, but okay, it's okay.
Okay. So Max, tell us first of all, before we get into it, how's New York been? How's the Big Apple been since lockdown?
Oh, well, we're hanging in there. I think it's been quite the past few months. I think that obviously it's been a very tough time for so many people over the past few months, and there was definitely as things were ramping up, more and more of the city was locked down, and people were staying in as much as possible. Now you're starting to see some restaurants and bars have some outdoor spaces to eat, but still there's not indoor dining. Indoor dining hasn't opened up yet, but it's I think overall the spirit has been very, very positive. I know a lot of people that have actually left the city and gone and kind of rode out this quarantine somewhere else as well. Me personally, I've been at my girlfriend's in Hoboken, which is in New Jersey, right across from New York, and same sort of thing here. And for the past few months, every single night at 7 p.m. here, there's been a cheer, everybody banging on pots and pans and round of applause, supporting everybody on the front lines. So it's been a very tough time, but it's been a very inspiring time as well.
Fantastic. Okay, so Max, tell us all about your Wild Business Growth podcast. How did that come about, and what is it that you like about podcasting? Because that's really the topic of the conversation tonight.
Yeah, and it's a loaded question, because there's not one thing I like about podcasting. There's a ton of things I like about podcasting. So Wild Business Growth podcast. So we mentioned my family business, actually Hippo Direct, second generation family business. My father, Greg, started it the year I was born. So I've grown up with the business. And when I joined a few years back, we were brainstorming ways to market the business from a digital sense. And podcasting was growing at the time. Obviously, podcasting is still growing, and now it's a new record every month now. But we just couldn't get the thought of podcasting out of our heads and say, you know what, this would be a really cool way to share stories of business people, to tie it back to growing your business, which is everything we do with our company, help customers grow their business. And this would be something that we should really focus on and see what comes out of it. And so came up with the idea for Wild Business Growth podcast to focus on, hey, what if we interviewed a new entrepreneur or creative business person, innovative business person every week, shared their story, and what can we do to make it as entertaining but also as valuable as possible, and share insights and different keys and tips for that anybody who's listening can apply to their business and unlock new stories for that, new avenues for their business. And fast forward, and actually last week we celebrated episode 100. So it's been absolutely, it feels like, in some ways, it feels like we just started, because it's been within the past couple of years that we started. But then you're always focused on the current episode and the next episode. But episode 100 it's been a very, very special time to reflect on, just how much has happened and how many amazing people we've met and how many amazing stories we've shared and just how many doors have been opened through this podcasting journey, because it's just very surreal to look back on. And you were asking about what I like about podcasting. And I think that's kind of what comes to the top, is just in having these conversations with inspiring and super talented business people, and sometimes not even non-business people. In having these conversations, there's something you can learn from every single conversation.
Mm.
And there's gems, whether you call it gems or, golden nuggets, there's things you can unlock in every single conversation. And you never really know when it's going to happen, but that's kind of a fun and challenging part of it, is uncovering, okay, here's how this person was able to really transform their career or have this growth, wild business growth. What can I take from that and use it for my career? And as a listener, you're thinking the same sort of thing. So the networking side of things, the being connected with these so many amazing individuals, and when you have an interview podcast, you're literally opening up an entirely new door and going in potential to meet with an entirely new network every single week. So it's an absolutely crazy journey, and I'm so glad and thankful that did decide to start the podcast in the first place.
Yeah. Now we've got a question coming through already. So Jace says, "Hi Jane and Max." Hi Jace, great to see you here. Jace is one of my fans, because she turns up every single week. So she loves these podcasts. So the question is, what do you think is better to reach a wide audience, using podcasting or YouTube or going live on social media? What would you say to that, Max?
Well, I think there's room for all of these, and that's the fun part as the industry is evolving. Is, at the start, podcasting is all audio. You only listen to it from the audio standpoint. Now, I've seen some reports recently by some of the top experts, Tom Webster of Edison Research to name. He was saying that for every podcaster, YouTube should be an absolute priority as far as getting your way. Like there's clear evidence that getting on YouTube is a clear way to grow your audience and grow your network from that standpoint, grow your podcast. And so I think I think the emphasis in the podcasting world should always be on audio. You want to make sure that the audio is good quality first. But on top of that, like, as you know, Jane, it's never been easier to record video on top of that. And so it certainly doesn't hurt if you want to have a video podcast as well and put it on YouTube from that standpoint. And then if you're going live, it's another way to show, like we're doing right now, like real, raw, just genuine conversation, which is a little bit different and even more kind of behind the scenes than a typical podcast where you might edit it after. So I think there's room for all three of them. You want to experiment and find out what works best for you, but there's no need to say, hey, I just like my podcast being audio, or I just like or my podcast has an audio focus, so it can't be on YouTube, or the other way around. There's room to put it on multiple channels like that. You just got to make sure, as you know, Jane, to have the right technology all lined up before you actually do go live with something.
Yeah. Now, Max, you are actually a podcasting production expert. And in fact, we were talking before we went live about you are actually in the process of launching an exclusive podcast agency. It's always been a part of what you do, but now it's going to turn into a complete business, isn't it? So
absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So Max absolutely is the expert. Oh, we've got some more questions coming through as soon as I mention that. So Max is the absolute expert on anything to do with podcast production, obviously marketing as well. So keep your questions coming. He's here. He's here to answer them. So what top tips do you have, says Jace, for someone just starting out as a newbie podcaster?
Yes, and I like the amount of 5, because I'm going to take a little note here to make sure I can count to 5 correctly and get them in line and get my thoughts in order. Okay, so number 1, I would say to do your research, and I guess I'll combine practice with that. So with that, definitely you want to spend a good amount of time before you get started, looking up, like, okay, what's actually involved in starting a podcast? What does this actually look like? Because it's a really foreign thing at the start. It's a different medium than so many people are used to. So you want to do your research. There's so many great resources online. Personally, I'm a huge fan of Pat Flynn, and he has endless resources on how to start a podcast. And here's, the 10 things you should do at the start. So look online, join groups like Podcast Movement Community on Facebook. There's some super helpful, valuable resources as far as starting out from that standpoint. Number 2, and you're going to laugh because it kind of goes without saying, but buy your microphone because there's only so far that you can go. There's only so much planning and practice things you can do until you actually get your equipment in line. And I see now we have another question that's about equipment, which is perfect. So I felt like when I was starting Wild Business Growth Podcast, I felt like I was learning a ton. It was I had a greater understanding. The more articles I looked up, the more I learned about the industry. But in order to actually make that jump and get closer to recording, you obviously need your microphone. And so the microphone I'm using right now, the microphone I love to use is the ATR 2100, which now they have the ATR 2100X, it's a USB mic. So it plugs into your laptop. You can record right into your laptop, but it also works with XLR cables. So if you want to put it into a mixer, like a Scarlett interface, or if you want to put it in like a Zoom H6, a portable recorder like that, it works from that standpoint as well. If you want to do, over time, as we get back to more and more in-person interviews. So buy your microphone. And once you have that, practice a ton, because it takes a while to get used to talking into the mic normally and not having like the announcer voice where you kind of sound all corny and like, hey, jam with the right hand. And then the next thing I would say is social media is incredibly valuable from the podcasting standpoint. And as Jane, you're an incredible connector, networker, and you know how valuable social media is just in the business space in general. In the podcast space, it's like that to another level, because if you are reaching out to a guest, if you have an idea of who you want to have on your podcast, if you're interviewing guests, it is extremely helpful in the first place to be connected with them on social media. So there's some sense of familiarity there. But even if you're not, if they see you're following them, even if it's right before, if they are able to check out your profile and see a little bit of what you're up to, what their background is, but also we'll use Instagram as an example. Instagram DM, all you have to do is follow somebody and send them a message. You can send a voice message to anybody you follow. And if you do it right and have an effective voice message, that could turn into a potential guest for you. And so that it's opened a ton of doors on the social media sense as well. That it's just super valuable from the podcasting standpoint.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually. Yeah. Well, I'll let you finish and then we'll go back to that.
I'll earmark it for after.
Yeah.
And then after that, I would say on that same social media note, if you're starting out as a newbie podcaster, it's very hard for people to discover your podcast if there's nothing on the internet and nothing on the social media about it. So you want to be as active as possible, sharing each new episode on social media. You want to be active if you have an email newsletter or email list, sending out every piece of new content from the podcast you have. You want to make sure you're typing it up in show notes on your blog. Make yourself as discoverable as possible, because that will make your podcast as discoverable as possible. And it might feel like at the start you're doing a ton of that, and you might be scared that you're going to annoy people or you're getting out with the same message all the time. But think about it. Even if you're posting out something tons of times a day, that's still a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver of what the person on the other end who's scrolling through their social media feed is seeing. So your message is just going to be a tiny, tiny fraction of a percentage of their day. So don't have any shame as far as getting the word out about your new podcast episodes, especially on social media. And then the last thing I would say is to stay incredibly positive and optimistic. And it's tough, and it takes a very long time to build a podcast. But if it's something that you truly love doing, if it's something that you really get joy out of and you're excited to go record and you're excited to share it out on social media, just keep your head up and keep going and keep churning out content, because podcasting, more than any other industry, is something that's built over dozens and dozens and hundreds of episodes and, weeks on weeks on weeks and in multiple years, as opposed to just, one or two episodes and then you make a big splash. It's really something that is a slow build over time. But if you keep that focus on quality, you make sure that the stuff you're putting out and the guests you have on are entertaining and valuable, and you keep that enthusiasm, then you can set yourself up for success. So keep smiling, keep your head up.
That's a great point, actually, because I often talk about brand equity. This is something that a lot of people are interested in. I think a lot of people expect instant results. And when you think about the big and the most valuable brands out there, they've been around for decades, haven't they? So really, the more and more investment you put into this and the more consistent you are and the more you show up week after week after week, of course, you are creating brand equity and value, and it's just going to go whoosh, after a while. That's what it does, as long as you keep showing up and just pay attention to the quality of the guests and also the topics and just keep on track. So that's a great point. Great point, Max.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it's amazing how it happens. And you don't, it takes us, like I was talking about with the 100th episode. It's important to take those moments every now and then and reflect back on how much you've grown, because there's so much that you'll grow every month. And there's something on the host side of things or the producer side of things. Each and every episode you do, you'll get a little bit more comfortable. You'll learn a little bit more. And so you look back after a few months or a year or 2 years and you go, wow, I've learned a ton, and look how much better I've gotten.
That's right. So before we go on to take some more questions, I just wanted to go back to this issue of guests. Now, obviously, I've had some fantastic guests on my podcast, and I reached out to you, and I'm so excited to have you here, Max. And I've just been very, very blessed that people have stepped up and said, yeah, I'm going to be on your podcast, and I love it, and I like the topic, and I like you, and all the rest of it. But I know that a lot of people have said to me that it is actually a struggle to get quality guests. So I'd be really interested, because I'm thinking, well, I'm on a roll. I've had some fantastic people, and every single interview that I've had has been very well received. And part of me is thinking, maybe I'm just on a winning streak, and at some point I'm gonna run out of those guests, because people who are more veteran podcasters have said to me, it is a struggle to keep it going and keep those guests coming. So what would you say to that, Max?
Yeah, it's a huge thing, because I think I actually scrolling through LinkedIn earlier today, I forget who it was, James Mulvaney, who's actually from the UK, in the podcasting space. We're connected on LinkedIn, and he did a poll to his LinkedIn connections and said, what's most important to you as a podcast listener? And there are a few different options, but of those options, the one that was the winner and had the majority of the votes was that the podcast has interesting and entertaining guests. Okay. And so choosing those guests is extremely essential. And so you really want to dedicate time every single week to making sure that you do have guests that are going to bring it, that are also a good fit with your show, and that your listeners are really going to enjoy. As I mentioned before, social media, again, is the backbone of everything. So social media gives you a place to seek out potential guests and actually connect, whether it's Instagram DMs or reaching out to them on Twitter, having a conversation from that standpoint, or on LinkedIn. It gives you avenues to reach out to people that, 20, 30 years ago, we just didn't have these options to reach out to people. So it's essential to be active in the social media space and take some time, as much as you can, to seek out potential guests, or maybe it's the thought of when you see somebody on your timeline retweet or share a post from someone or post it in their Instagram story, and you say, oh, wow, what that person's doing seems really interesting. Make a note right then and there to follow that person or engage with that person, because just adding to your network piece by piece or finding interesting people like that, they could, just one instance of hearing about somebody could be something that leads to a future podcast guest. So you want to keep an open mind from that standpoint. What I like to do to ensure that I'm always staying ahead of the curve and I never feel like, oh my God, I got to get somebody for next week, or I'm not going to have, a podcast next week. I like to stay about a month, about 4 to 6 weeks of recorded interviews and guests lined up ahead of when I actually release the podcast. So in doing that, I make a point, actually every Thursday. I did it earlier today. I make a point every single Thursday, and I have time in my calendar to reach out to 5 potential podcast guests and say, and invite them and say, hey, would you love to do a Zoom interview? However you're doing the interviewing, would you be willing to do a podcast interview in the next 2 or 3 months? And just a little bit of rundown of what the podcast is. And I find that is super helpful, because if you do that every single week, and just think about it, that's 5 people a week. That's not going to take too much of your time. If you do that every single week, it is extremely helpful for your podcast as far as getting guests and always having a great run of guests coming up.
Yeah.
And the more that what's actually helpful within that as well is the more episodes and the more previous guests that you have, it becomes easier and easier to name drop people that this potential guest might actually know or might be connected to themselves. So it becomes an easier yes with certain people over time. So that's extremely helpful.
That's a really good point. And that's something that I also do, Max. So I actually tend to work on a Sunday, because I just find that's a time when nobody contacts me, so I can really get my head down. I can really think about the podcast and think about the kind of guests that I want to bring on in order to shape it, because it is a creative endeavor, really, isn't it? I know, obviously,
Yes.
it's about marketing and about your profile and so on, but it is actually a creative pursuit. And I think that's why
100%.
it's so much fun, because you're shaping it all the time. It's a living thing, isn't it? A podcast.
It is. Yeah, it is. And it becomes something that I think a lot of podcasters, before they start, know it's something they're going to be at least somewhat passionate about, or it's going to be a big focus for them. And then once you start it, and then once you start having these conversations, and then once you see people enjoying them and it impacting your business and their business, you get super crazy passionate about it. And then it becomes a whole nother thing, to the point that, hey, you might start, considering starting a business or a business line focus on the podcast world as well. So that's exciting. And it's a very much so growing industry, and it's never been easier to start a podcast, and never been easier to listen to podcasts.
Well,
so
listen,
it's a very exciting time for that.
That's right. So listening to podcasts is something, as you said, that it's very, very easy to do. And I tend to do it when I go out for a walk locally. So I'll put in my little earpods and I'll just, walk in a really nice place, walk through the forest or down through the lake, and just it's like having company, having a friend. That's what it feels like. It's great. I love it.
It is. Yeah. And I ask, people ask me from the business standpoint, from the production standpoint, okay, what if we were starting a podcast for our brand, or it could be your personal brand, what makes it different than other platforms? And I say, well, what if you could have any message or any story you want literally in the ears, literally inside the head of your audience? And not only that, but your audience, your listeners can tune in, whether they're walking like yourself, whether they're they could be playing it through their car speakers. They could be working out, have headphones in. They could be, a lot of people do it while doing laundry. Typically when commutes are more common, it's during the commute as well. So it's a really, really unique medium like that, that you can gain so much insight and have such an enjoyable and intimate experience while you're even doing something else and being productive in another part of your life. So it's really, really special from that standpoint. Yeah.
So tell me, have you had a favorite guest, Max? Have you got a particularly memorable interview that you'd love to, if our listeners said, oh, I really want to check out your podcast, is there one interview that was just your favorite?
Yes, it's a great question, because I think people continue to surprise me. You never know what to expect when you interview somebody. Hopefully I'm surprising you right now. No, I'm just kidding. But I find lots of joy in every single interview. So I don't get in trouble with my parents. I have interviewed each of my parents in separate interviews. So I'm going to have to say them. No, I would say them anyway. It was really special. I interviewed back in episode 18, interviewed my dad, Greg, our founder and president of Hippo Direct. And that was really special. I'd never done that before. And that was over Thanksgiving week. And it was just a really special time for family. So that was really cool. And at the time was really, really breakthrough and unique from other interviews I'd done. And then actually a year after that, which was episode 70, interviewed my mom, Joanne, who is our CFO. So it was really special. I'm really happy. And it was just a really special time interviewing my parents, especially one-on-one like that, because it was really interesting to hear both of their sides of our family business, as well as what they did before our family business. And then, of course, there's lots of I don't get embarrassed easily, but there's lots of embarrassing stories about me as a child in each of those. So those are great.
I'll listen in then, definitely.
Yeah,
that always makes it interesting.
So those are great. I will also say, if you haven't listened to Wild Business Growth podcast before, we mentioned that we recently celebrated and released episode 100, and episode 100 was so crazy cool because it was totally different than every other episode we'd done. So as opposed to interviewing typically one entrepreneur each episode, episode 100 was a mix of, for the first time we had returning guests. We actually had 8 returning guests, and we had never had a returning guest before. We had a bunch of highlights and some best of moments from the previous episodes, first 99 episodes. And then a lot of people's favorite part, we had previously unreleased bloopers and outtakes that transpired everywhere from the early test recording sessions to all the way through episode 99. So that was really, really special. If you are new to the podcast, that's a great place to start episode 100, because it's a little bit longer, but not too much longer. But it was you'll get a really good feel for the podcast, and you also hear from a lot of the other amazing episodes out there.
Great. So Max, I wanted to ask you about genres, because when people ask me about a podcast, and this is like not necessarily a business crowd, because obviously they know what I do, but people who are not particularly familiar with podcasts, they say, well, what would you make a podcast about? And I say, well, you can make a podcast about anything that you're interested in. So I'm just, people can make a podcast about golf. They could make there are podcasts about golf, or about horses, or about anything, any topic that you can imagine. There's a podcast for it. So I'm interested to know, Max, what is the most popular genre for podcasts? Would you happen to know? Is it business?
So there's a lot of businesses towards the top. There's some of the most popular categories, which also keep in mind, as a podcast host, as a new podcast host, you have to decide, am I passionate enough about this one area that it's definitely going to be this, or is it so ridiculously crowded in this area that it's not even worth going there, and maybe I should start in a more niche area. By the way, I have a question for you. I had Chris Ducker on, and he said people in the UK and people in the US say niche and niche different. How do you say it?
It's niche.
Okay.
I actually wrote an article about this the other day. I haven't published it yet, but it was from hyper niche. But I did listen to that. I did make reference to that because, of course, in the US you always say niche. But the reason why we say niche is because we were mostly brought up to learn French in schools, and niche is a French word. So that's the only reason why.
That's actually very helpful. Yeah, I like the sound of niche. Yes, so I guess Americans typically say niche, but anyway, that niche aside, it's very helpful to be niched or niche down. In the podcast industry. And so you'd be surprised, some of the most successful podcasts out there are as something as specific as breeding chameleons, or a previous guest I had on, Jim Harold, has built an empire of over 40 million downloads, and he's built his own business from podcasting and from what he does with all his podcasts. And he's in the paranormal space, and he's not like a ghost hunter. He's not somebody who's knows the paranormal side of things outside of talking to people, but he just realized he liked talking about ghost stories with people, and has a bunch of different podcasts where he does this. And now this guy who used to work in radio and have all sorts of radio talk about all sorts of things is like the paranormal podcasting guy and has made his career off of it. So it doesn't hurt to be as specialized as possible. I think some of the biggest, most popular categories are businesses up there. There's also news or politics. There is the comedy world as well, and sports. Those rise to the top. But there's a ton as well. I mean, there's a ton of travel podcasts, and I think what's cool is, if we're talking about getting more focused, what's cool is you can look at these broad categories, and then you can narrow in focus, and then there are so many different subcategories within it. So Wild Business Growth, yes, it's a business podcast, but yes, it's also, if you're more focused, it's an entrepreneurship podcast. It's an entrepreneurship podcast. We also talk a lot of marketing. We also dive deep into creativity. And then also there's a lot of elements of comedy as well. So just if you're in one of those giant categories doesn't mean that you just need to have sort of broad appeal in that space. You can get really, really focused. I would just think about why you're starting the podcast. Is it for business reasons? And then what's going to be most relevant content to drive those business results for you and your business? Or is it more of just a personal podcast, and maybe it's just something that you really, really enjoy talking about and don't mind spending tons of hours putting out, because you need that commitment to it, and you need to have fun doing it.
I think the other thing about it is that because we have to dedicate so much time to our podcast, once you get a podcast going, there's no point in just doing an episode once a month or once every couple of months, or doing 3 and then stopping. It's just a waste. You've got to hit the ground and then do it consistently. And what that means is that every week you are going to be having conversations with people that are quite intense, just like we are now, because we're really focused on this one topic. We're really trying to create value for the audience, and it's got to be a topic that you're actually really, really interested in and you want to keep learning about, I think, because that's what motivates you. It's what keeps you coming back. Would you agree with that, Max?
It is. Yeah. Because I think most new podcasters especially are very surprised to find out how much time it takes to put together a single episode. It could take you 5 to 6 hours every single week to put out just that one episode each week. And so it's like, if you think at a broader scale, if you think about what you're doing for your job or your career, you want to be doing something that you're passionate about, because you're going to spend a ton of time there. You're going to, you might spend more time there than you do sleeping, which is crazy to think about. But same thing applies in the podcast space. This is a big time commitment, a big endeavor for you. So you have to be doing something that gets you excited and that you cannot wait for, that next interview that you have on the calendar, or that next episode that you're releasing and sharing out. And so finding a topic that puts a smile on your face and gets you hungry for the next interview and the next interview and the next interview is crucial.
Yes. And I have actually seen people stop when they started a podcast because they thought that it would be helpful to their business. And then after a while, it just got hard going because they thought, well, I'm just doing it because I thought it would be good for my business, but I'm actually getting really bored of having the same conversations with the same type of people week after week after week. And in fact, I want to do something more for me. I've seen that happen.
Yeah.
So it is very important to really think hard, I think, not just about your audience, but also about you and what's going to enrich your life through doing this, because it serves 2 purposes, doesn't it, really? It's obviously for your audience and for your business and so on, but it's also it's something that it's taking up your time, and it's got to be enriching to you too.
Yeah. It needs to be. You should you should grow, and your guests should grow, and your listeners should grow as part of the podcast. There's a lot of positives that can come out of it. And so you can set yourself up for that if you are in a space where it's something that you don't mind. Think about something that you wouldn't mind talking about for an hour every single week for years, or however long you want to do the podcast. Think of something that you want to talk about for an hour, at least an hour every single week. That's what you should do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So imagine if you had a friend and you were really looking forward to meeting them, and you had this regular meeting every week, or maybe you went out for dinner, and every single week you're looking forward to seeing that friend because you always talk about X. So if that X might be the way in.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so Max, tell us about the new agency then. Who are you going to be serving? What sort of people? Because really it's an expansion of what you're already doing. So what kind of people come to you and actually ask for help launching a podcast and I guess hosting it? Do you host it for them, or how does it work?
It's been a mix. So most of the time I am more behind the scenes on the production side. And I call it the 3 Ps of podcasting. So if you think about it, there's planning, there's production, and then there's promotion. Because if you think about it, it's kind of before the podcast, during the podcast, and then once the episodes are released, sharing it out. So those 3 things are what I help my clients with. And so most of my clients are either small business owners and entrepreneurs, or they're in the marketing departments of whatever business they're in. So it's people that are running businesses, or people that are essential from the marketing standpoint and looking for ways to market their brand or business. And so nothing's going to change from that standpoint as the entity changes, goes a little rebranding. But most of the time with my clients, I'm on this behind the scenes, I'm working on the 3 Ps, and then the client totally owns the podcast. They do the hosting. And a lot of them say basically, hey, I want to do the interviewing. I want to, team with you and the planning and the artwork and all things from that standpoint. And then I'm going to post it out to, my social media and all that. But I want you to take care of everything else. And then so that's where I come in. I help them and give recommendations and suggestions as far as everything from the podcast name to the artwork, the description, episode titles and descriptions, who might be a good guest for them. And then on the production side, that's where a lot of the time consuming factor comes in is I'm doing the podcast editing. And so that's really, really nice for the clients is though, think as a podcast host, think of the idea that you could have an interview, you could have a really rewarding conversation with somebody. And then as opposed to knowing that you're going to have to spend hours and hours getting this wrapped up, ready for release, they send it off to me and then I take care of all that and then send it to them, for the final files once it's ready to go. So that part is the editing part, the production part is extremely helpful. And then I'll make clips. You've probably seen these before, audiograms, which are like, which Headliner is a big one. I like to use Wave, WAVVE.co, but they're basically takes the audio of the podcast and turns it into video form. And of course, if you're using video, like how you're doing, Jane, you can of course do video snippets that are, from the actual recording that you can share out. But with audiograms, you can do that from pure audio as well and send that out. I do have a client where that is in a very niched industry where they actually wanted to partner and wanted me to be the host and actually interview them. So I'll shout them out. Howard Shear and Rex Anderson. Podcast is called Laundry Money, and their businesses, they realize how they're in the laundry space, and they realize how great of an investment opportunity it is. If someone's looking for an investment to actually own and invest in a laundromat.
Okay.
And so it's something probably a lot of people haven't thought of. It's a super niche category. But if you're somebody who's heading a little bit more towards retirement age and you have money saved up and you want to look for an investment opportunity, this could be a perfect opportunity for you. So in that case, they weren't familiar from the podcasting side about how to make things work. But they are the true experts in their space. So they said, hey, Max, would you come on? Would you be the host, kind of as like the neutral, like moderator, the host, and lead the podcast along and interview both of us as part of it? And then we can really answer questions about how this works, why it isn't a good investment opportunity for you. So it's fun to kind of play both sides of that as well.
Oh, that sounds really cool. Well, nobody's asked me to do that yet, but yeah, I'm
we'll find somebody to ask you, Jane. I'm sure you'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so Max, if somebody was to come to you and just say, look, I really don't know whether podcasting is right for me, but I just want you to advise me because I'm sitting on the fence right now. What would you say?
I would say it goes back to if your heart is really in it and if you're really enthusiastic about it. So if you have a line of your business that you're really passionate about and you know could be of great value to people, and you're open to marketing that in audio form or even video form on top of that, but mainly audio form from the podcasting world, then podcasting is a great fit for you, because no matter what you're offering, there's an audience out there. That's just the tricky part and fun part, is finding out where that audience is. So it's great from a business standpoint. And then from the personal standpoint, again, if there's something that you're super passionate about that you could talk about for hours every single week, talk about X at the bar every single week, then podcasting is right for you. If you are on the fence about the idea and you think that, if not enough people are listening right away, or if I'm not happy with the sound of my voice after a few episodes, then I'm going to quit, then I would say podcasting isn't a good fit for you, because it's not something that's going to be made in just a few episodes at the start like that. And to be fair, everybody hates the sound of their own voice at the start. So it's something that you do get over time. But you have to be committed for somewhat of a long term if you want to get into the podcasting space, if you want to make it successful. And I think way more often than not, new podcasters are disappointed with how many people are listening at the start. But then because you've been spent so much time working on this thing, and then finally it's the big launch, and then, oh, okay, I thought more people were going to listen. But just know that that's going to build over time. It's definitely going to build over time. The more episodes and the more you work on your marketing of it over time, the more quality guests you put on, there's a natural growth there, and there's things you can do to help that. But at the same time, if you're new to starting a podcast, you really have to know that you need thick skin. You need thick skin, because nothing's going to happen in a single episode. Nothing's going to happen in just a few episodes, as far as people like falling in love with the messaging that you're having out or the stories that you're sharing like that. And so there's not a single podcast that started off and people were just blown away by the listeners right away and said, you know what, we did 2 episodes. It, turned our business to a multi-million-dollar business, and here we are. It doesn't work like that. So you have to keep it up for the long haul. But if you keep the enthusiasm, you keep that commitment to quality and sharing great stories, then you have the right mindset. So that's how you know it's right for you.
Awesome. So one more question, Max, which is a very important one. And this is another one that people ask me, and they say, well, how do you monetize a podcast? So what answer would you have to that?
Yeah. So it's kind of a myth of podcasting that it seems a lot easier than it is, especially at the start, to get ads on your podcast, ad support from outside vendors. To put it in perspective, a lot of the biggest advertisers out there are looking for you to have somewhere between at least 5,000 to 10,000 downloads per episode when they consider advertising for your podcast. And so that takes a really long time to get to that amount for the average podcaster. Now, so that's kind of like a big hurdle that might be off the table for you, especially at the start. There are other ways to do that. You can make think of people in your network that might be interested in advertising to your audience. Think of people, it could be somebody you're doing business with. It could be your neighbor who has this business that happens to be a good fit with your audience.
Yeah.
You can make deals that don't have that same download requirement as far as getting ads on your podcast. And podcast advertising is a really effective form of advertising because, like we were saying earlier, your message is literally in someone's head. It's literally in their ears. And you can, as an advertiser, depending on which podcast you target, you can get super targeted with your messaging, and you can find podcasts and advertise on podcasts that are an exact match for what you're promoting or what you have to offer. Now, so that's on the podcast ad side of things. So I call that direct revenue from podcasts, which takes a long time to come by. And is a bit of more of a long-term play. What I have seen and experienced more firsthand, and what I see happening a lot in the industry and a growing trend, is what I call indirect revenue from podcasting.
Mm-hmm.
That is, you never know what each episode and each interview with the new guest is going to turn into, what doors that's going to open. And this was not my intention when I started the podcast, but I turn around now and there are several guests who I've had on the show that I'm now helping from a podcast production side, or was introduced from those guests to somebody else in their network, and now I'm helping them from the podcast production side. Mm-hmm. And so that's an example that I'm experiencing firsthand of making money off this podcast, helping others out with their podcast. But it doesn't need to be in the podcasting space. That same approach can apply to saying, hey, you've had a guest on and they realize that, what you're offering, this skill or service that you're offering is super valuable to me. So I'm actually going to work with you. And, we don't even need an intro call because we just connected over a podcast. There's also that same idea of, you just had a really great conversation. Both sides really enjoyed it. You can be, if you're smart with your messaging, as our mutual buddy Ryan Folan talks about.
Yeah.
If you're smart with your messaging, if you're short and sweet with your messaging, and people know how to identify you based on what you offer, then you are instantly top of mind for that person. And so they can go across and look at their network and say, hey, so-and-so, Jane is the connector. She helps with connecting people. Like, you need to talk to her if you have a need for this. So it's opening a new door with each interview. And that same thing can apply, especially down the line. That same thing can apply from a listener standpoint, and your listeners will realize over time and establish a connection with you for what you represent, what you do, and you'll be top of mind for listeners as well for business opportunities. So there's a lot more ways to make money indirectly from that standpoint, but those are kind of like the biggest things that come to mind from the monetization standpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that issue of top of mind, it's not something that you can directly look at the stats on and say, okay, this is worth, £1,000, $1,000 to me this week or whatever.
Right.
You can't necessarily do that. But I do know that since I've started my podcast, people have really, really warmed up to me because they feel as though they know me. So when I do put out an offer,
Jane, I feel like we go back like 15 years.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So what happens is when I do put out an offer, and I put out an offer recently because we're actually beta testing a new, it's a little mini course with a technology product. So it's a mixture of both. But putting out the offer recently, people were just, they were actually really falling over themselves. And I think part of that was because they trusted me, because they feel as though they know me. And of course they do, because something like this gives them the opportunity to see the kind of person that you are. And so they feel more comfortable. So it definitely does go a long way. I think it's a very valuable tool. And that is really what this whole Connection Central strand is all about. It's about how do you actually cut through that barrier, that kind of online thing, that and actually make a connection, a genuine connection with people, so that they feel as though they do know you. And that really is the beauty of podcasting.
It is. Yeah, it's magical. And I think that's the most surprising thing, is you really never know what a single conversation will turn into.
That's right.
I look at some of my clients now, some of my closest clients. I interviewed over a year ago and just thought it was a great conversation. And then, fast forward several months after that, we had another random conversation. And then after that, now, we're partnering on this, and we're introducing these people to each other. You really never know what it can turn into. And so that part, it's magical as the magician, as the expert here.
Okay. Well, I think probably by the time people have finished listening to this interview, they're going to be absolutely raring to go. They're going to be dying to launch their own podcast if they haven't already. So, Max, tell us what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I appreciate it. You can reach me. You can just email me directly at max@hippodirect.com. That's MAX at hippo like the animal, direct like the word direct, and direct mail, .com. So just shoot me a note, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have about the podcasting space. Whether you are considering a podcast, whether you're in that stage that you'd like a podcast but aren't sure where to start, or you're thinking of launching one soon, or maybe you've had a podcast for a year and a half, but you're sick and tired of spending all the long hours doing it. You'd like some help on the back end of that. So happy to help answer questions anyway. Reach me at max@hippodirect.com.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an awesome interview. I've loved it so much. And I know that I'm going to get some incredible feedback because it's been a really, really, really powerful interview. And I've actually learned a lot as well. So thank you very much.
Oh, of course. Well, thank you so much, Jane. This has been awesome. It's so fun talking about it. It's, of course, gets meta when we're talking about the enthusiasm and rewarding bits of conversation that come from podcasting. And, we're living it right now. But I really appreciate your time, and a lot I've learned from you, and you run a great show as well. So really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Okay, Max, bye for now. Have a great day, because it's only lunchtime, isn't it? So you've got your whole day ahead of you.
A little bit. We're kind of in between lunch and dinner, but as a person who loves to eat, I'll happily have a second lunch. Thank you.
Okay. All right then. Bye for now.
All right. Bye.